bankrupt. Peggy started to shake her head in denial, but stopped herself, too aware that the wedding guests in pews must be watching the two women in pink. After all, there was no wedding ceremony to watch at the moment. Even if there's no wedding, the bride's family will have to pay the vendors. Flowers, musicians, catering, decorations. We put down the deposits for those things, not them. The bride kept saying the groom was paying for this and that, but I couldn't wait for them to sort out who was paying for what. Precious Moments keeps funds on hand for situations where you have to secure a vendor pronto. We're supposed to get reimbursed by the client later, but Peggy weighted her future in the balance. The company is still awaiting on payment from the last event's host, so I took you on as a partner. I needed more working capital. I used your money to secure this event while we wait for payment on the last event. If this bride takes it into her head not to pay us for the wedding she didn't have. Oh, Janet, it was another betrayal. Janet had said she admired Peggy's interior design skills. Janet had been excited to share the dream of owning their own business. Maybe those were still true, but Janet had needed her cash, all the savings Peggy had managed to rebuild after paying off her own wedding that didn't happen. The office door suddenly opened with a rush of air. A very angry-looking father of the bride stalked out. He brushed right past them and headed for the pew where his wife sat silently, as still as a marble statue. Janet hissed a quiet curse word without disturbing her calm facade. He doesn't look like he's going to pay our invoice this week, does he? The door opened again and Clay walked out just as Peggy's tears threatened to spill over. He stopped short so close that the black wool of his tux stirred the pink chiffon of her skirt as he addressed Janet. You must be the wedding planner. I was asked to find you. Janet stuck her hand out to shake. Yes, I'm Janet from Precious Moments. This is my partner. Clay had already turned to her. Margot, isn't it? He didn't recognize her. Peggy had guessed that, but it was awful to look into a once-favorite face and know she was nobody to him. The first tear fell. She dashed it away. Clay started to reach a hand out to her, hesitated, then cupped her elbow in his warm palm, although he thought they were strangers. Are you okay? I'm fine. She resisted the impulse to jerk her arm free. She'd lost so much money on her own cheating groom. Now another cowboy's cheating ways were going to make her go broke. This is just a job, just a job. You were sent to find us about what Peggy was proud that her voice reasonably professional. Clay let go of her and stuck his hand into his pocket, drawing his black jacket open across his broad chest. He held the black Stetson in his other hand and tapped it against his thigh just once. He looked as handsome as a damned cowboy menswear model. Alvin would like to talk to you two. He's asked me to make the announcement that the wedding has been called off. Janet cursed again, louder this time. You, Peggy asked, incredulous. He wants you to make the announcement. Clay shrugged. It's the least I could do. I feel a little responsible for this mess. A little, Peggy repeated. A little. She'd had enough. Enough bad memories, enough fresh betrayals, enough of everything. Peggy pushed her way right between Janet and Clay and marched down the center aisle and out of the church. Margot, don't leave. The other woman in pink, the one named Janet, managed to hiss the words under her breath without any desperation breaking through her placid expression. Clay watched as Margot kept walking straight down the center aisle, then out the same wide door through which the bride in the giant white dress had made her grand entrance. She thought he was the one who'd slept with the bride. Clay knew it in his bones. In the office, Clay had been struck by her horrified expression. Too late, he'd realized he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Brad. Alvin must have looked like he was pointing at him. Margot, don't leave. Let me explain. Clay had a fierce compulsion to follow her and make sure she knew the truth. He couldn't shake that feeling he'd had on the sidewalk that she was here, as if she were someone he'd been waiting for. He couldn't let her disappear now. "Before you make any announcement," Janet said, "let me talk to the bride and groom." Janet's dress was the same shade of pale pink as Margot's, a welcome reminder that they worked together as the wedding planners. Margot couldn't be going far. Clay reined in his impatience. He had one last duty as a groomsman at this disaster of a wedding. One last obligation before he could explore this instant attraction to the mysterious Margot. "You won't change Alvin's mind," he said to Janet. Clay walked to stand where the bride and groom should have been front and center before hundreds of people. This wasn't a rodeo arena, but a cowboy's deep voice was useful to get the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," all eyes turned toward him. Clay paused. He'd made a lot of speeches and proposed a lot of toasts as a groomsman over the past 10 years, but never anything like this. "Ladies and gentlemen, Alvin has asked me to say a few words. There will be no wedding today. Alvin is calling it off." The crowd broke into a collective sound of surprise. Clay held his hands out to ask for silence. The backs of his hands were scarred from years of hard work. But he'd rather wrestle a bull to the ground right now than give the rest of the speech. A man didn't get to choose which animal would test him. "To all of the guests who made the effort to be here today, Alvin apologizes. He would have canceled the wedding sooner, but he only found out moments ago that the bride had made it clear that she prefers another man." Last night, the gasps were loud and plentiful, but Clay deliberately walked over to stand in front of the groom's side. "Alvin's friends and family are invited to head over the reception for some food and drink. He'll come over once he's handled his business here. Thank you again for coming." And with that duty discharged, Clay headed down the center aisle to leave through those double doors himself. His exit signaled that the event was over. Guests could head out just as he was. It signaled the end to everyone except him. Clay was free now to go find the woman in the pink dress. For him, things were just beginning. Clay burst from the church doors, then stopped to let his eyes adjust to the bright June sun. A white carriage awaited a tame white horse standing in its traces. There was no sign of Margot anywhere, no pastel pink against the gray asphalt and brown buildings. He put his hat on and headed for the horse, who was listening patiently as the driver complained while removing a "just married" sign from the carriage. The driver must have already heard the wedding was off, and there was only one person he could have heard it from. "G'afternoon." Clay got down to business. "Which way did the woman in pink go?" The driver tossed the sign onto the padded bench seat of the open carriage, headed off toward the reception hall. On foot, the reception was being held at least a half-mile from the church, and Margot wasn't wearing workout clothes. "I'm not taking anybody anywhere if I don't get paid." Bride said the groom would pay. "I'll bet you dollars to donuts that the groom will say the bride has to pay. I'm the sucker who's out of a Saturday's work." 2 limos were waiting behind the carriage. They'd probably be used to take the bridal party back to whichever hotel they'd come from. Margot might have thought it would just be quicker to walk than it would be to wait for the limos to return and pick up the groom. Or she was upset and trying to walk off some bad feelings. Clay reached into his jacket's inner pocket for his money clip. "I'm paying. Let's go find the woman in pink." Peggy stalked more than 2 full blocks in the hot Texas sun before she cooled off. Rational thought returned. She'd made a spectacle of herself storming out of the church like that, but there was no harm done. Nobody except Janet knew she'd once had a wedding stopped during the ceremony. Clay Cooper didn't even recognize her, although that made her feel worse, really. But it shouldn't. If he was that bad of a friend to the groom, she didn't want or need to rekindle any friendship with him. The most rational, practical thought of all was that it was too warm and the reception venue was too far for her to walk the whole way. With a sigh, Peggy turned back to the church, but within 2 steps she froze on the sidewalk. A white horse was clopping toward her. White horse. White carriage driver in a white top hat. But in the back sat Clay Cooper, black cowboy hat low over his brow, arms spread across the seat back as if he owned the whole damned carriage. He was too handsome, this grown-up version of her childhood crush. Too cowboy. "Going my way," he drawled as the carriage pulled up. A cheating cowboy, she had to remind herself. No, it wasn't quite a lie. She was heading back to the church and Janet's car after all. "You seem angry," he said. "No." Clay shook his head as he leaned forward. "You gotta be angry if you're walking a half-mile in those pretty shoes." He planted 2 strong hands on the side of the carriage and vaulted over the side tuxedo tails, flying to land on the sidewalk beside her. "Let me give you a ride." He unfolded the steps that led up to the cushy carriage seat and held out his hand to assist her. At her hesitation, he withdrew his hand and used it to push the brim of his hat up. "I don't bite. Got a driver here to chaperone, too." He said it with a smile, but she felt how foolish she was being as she wilted on the sidewalk. So with a half-hearted smile, she took the first step up. Her foot slipped on the second step, but before she could finish a yelp of surprise, Clay's hands caught her about the waist. "Okay," he asked. She teetered on one foot on the bottom step. They were nose to nose, or maybe she was a half-inch taller, one hand on his shoulder for balance. His hands gripped her waist harder. "Peggy. Peggy Winston. Where have you been all my life?" "It's me, Clay Cooper." The masculine hands holding her steady on the unstable step squeezed her a little tighter. "From Frontier Middle School. Do you remember me?" "Well." Peggy felt tongue-tied. She balanced on the step with one foot. It should have felt precarious, but with her hand on Clay's solid shoulder, her other foot was free to swing a little bit in the summer air. "Sure, I recognized you right away." "You did." He seemed delighted with her even as he shook his head. "I knew there was something about you, but I couldn't place it. Did you notice me staring at you?" "Kind of." But then he'd glared at the bride. Peggy bent her knee a little, but she wasn't sure if she should hop to the ground or if she should climb into the carriage. Clay noticed. "Sorry. Here." He let go of her waist with one hand and turned so she could climb into the carriage. "You must need to go to the reception, right?" At her nod, he gestured to the driver, and then he joined her, so they sat side by side on the bench seat, moving at the speed of the comforting, placid clop of a horse's hooves. She arranged her skirt hyper-aware of how their bodies were almost touching, and she felt her cheeks heat. It was as thrilling and as embarrassing as the moment a teacher had told her to slip her arm through his before they walked on stage when she'd been his little pilgrim wife in the school's Thanksgiving play. "Peggy Winston," he repeated with a hint of boyish wonder in his tone. "You sure grew up." "No more braids. Your teeth look great." She stopped fussing with her skirt. "What?" "Your teeth. You got your braces off." That surprised a laugh out of her. "Well, yes, just a little while ago. Like 15 years. They sat there smiling at each other for a moment. He was looking at her intently, taking in every feature, and she knew he was overlaying his memory of her younger self with the adult version, just as she had with him as he'd stood at the altar. The altar. The wedding. She stopped smiling and looked away. "So, you grew up to be a wedding planner?" he said with all the satisfaction of a man who'd solved an old mystery. "No." She sat up straighter and scowled at the slow-moving scenery. "I hate weddings. Really? There was something in his tone, curiosity gentled with concern. She'd given herself away, maybe. Been a little too harsh. Bitter. He covered her silence. I've had my fill too, personally. It seems like all I do is go to weddings, no matter which part of the country I happen to be in. If I'm not a guest, I'm in the wedding party itself. I must rent 2 tuxes a year, at least. Peggy tried to force a polite smile, but he wasn't a stranger with whom she should make small talk, and this wasn't a normal wedding. It wasn't a wedding at all now. It was just a mess for everyone involved, including herself. He smoothed over her silence once more. You know you've been in too many weddings when you start finding excuses to miss the bachelor parties. They get more expensive than fun. Weddings in general are more expensive than fun. That's the way it's starting to feel to me anyway. Clay shifted on the seat, angling toward her. How about you, Peggy Winston? His voice was quiet, the bass note intimate. Why don't you like weddings? Peggy tried to dodge Clay's question. I'm new to the company. We're supposed to do corporate events, conventions, cocktail parties for businesses. I was told we'd do as few weddings as possible, and that's important to you because... The horse clopped along in a smooth rhythm, marking the seconds as Peggy held on to her composure. Her old friend Clay had become this sexy adult Clay with a deep voice that came from a broad chest. Too sexy she was, as tempted as the bride apparently had been. Have you ever been married? He asked. No, me neither. He paused. So, do you not want to work at weddings for business reasons? Aren't they profitable or... I can't do this! The words came out in a rush, almost a shout. The driver jerked in his seat and started to turn around, then seemed to remember he wasn't supposed to intrude. He kept his head turned slightly their way. Peggy kept her voice down, but the emotions of the day made it waver with anger or frustration or something else she couldn't or wouldn't name. I can't keep pretending this is some kind of lovely little reunion between school friends when you just destroyed a man's wedding. You slept with the bride. Peggy glanced from Clay to the driver, who was just about twisting his head all the way around in his effort not to miss a word. She glared at the horse's rump. The horrible heat was back in her cheeks. In fact, she felt hot all over in this open carriage under the June sun. She wished this conversation, this carriage ride, this whole miserable day were over. And I'm so disappointed in you. She finished, bitterness in her heart and on her tongue. Clay's hand was suddenly on her jaw, lightly, firmly turning her face to his. I didn't sleep with the bride. Alvin pointed right at you. He was pointing at the man standing next to me, if you want to call him a man. But Peggy had sworn never to doubt her own eyes again, yet her heart was already lifting, eager to believe him. His fingertips were warm, but not overheated, like her skin. He was looking at her openly, his gaze steady. She couldn't be a fool again, not twice in a year. But you said you felt responsible. That was why you were making the announcement. I said a little responsible. He dropped his hand. I'm the one who caught them last night, in my own hotel room. I didn't know who she was, though. I missed the rehearsal dinner, so when the father lifted the bride's veil, he glanced ahead, but Peggy saw him grimace. I considered not saying anything. Maybe it would never have happened again. Maybe they would have worked things out, but I only had a minute to decide. I had to put myself in his shoes. Would I want to know if I was the groom? The carriage came to a halt in front of a brick warehouse that had been converted into a rentable event space. As the driver pushed the brake lever into place, Clay hopped down and held up a hand to help her. Her feet had barely touched the pavement when she started to let go of him, but Clay held her hand a little tighter and bent his head a lot closer, so the brim of his cowboy hat shaded them both. Do you think I did the right thing? Peggy hesitated, her hand in his. Did she believe him? She wanted to. As close as they stood, she could see that he'd shaved for the wedding. He smelled wonderfully clean, just a hint of soap, nothing artificial or fake about him. He was taller than she was, harder than she was, a familiar friend, in some ways, a handsome stranger in others. Oh, how she wanted to. But in the minister's office, had there been another man standing beside him? Had there been anyone else the groom might possibly have been pointing at in anger? She hadn't noticed one, if there had been one. "You believe me, don't you?" he asked. Peggy looked into his eyes, and Clay looked right back, patient and serious, unafraid to look her in the eyes. He was nothing like the man who'd once cheated on her and lied to her up to the last possible moment. Her ex-fiancé had never managed to hold her gaze so steadfastly. He'd been wrong, and he'd known it, so he'd always been restless when Peggy had dared to ask. A little piece of her own confidence fell into place, something she hadn't realized was missing until it returned. She knew the difference between a good man and a liar. She could trust her impression of Clay. "I trust you." He smiled then and leaned just a little bit away from her. "I should hope so. You know me too well to think I'd sleep with another man's wife, or wife-to-be." They were still holding hands. Peggy let go. "Well, I know who you were when you were 12. People change." "Not that much." "Yes, they do." "Really?" he drawled, but he was smiling at her fully now. "So, you're not the smartest girl around anymore." Peggy made a show out of looking over her left shoulder, then her right. "I'm the only girl around. I guess I'm the smartest one at the moment. And you're still the girl who isn't afraid to take charge and tell everyone else what they should be doing." The driver chose that moment to call down from his perch. "Are you folks still planning to take any photos with the carriage?" "No, all of that has been canceled," Peggy said. "You can leave now if you like. We won't be needing you any more today." Clay only lifted a brow as he smiled at her. Yep, still the decision maker. His smile made it clear that he liked that about her. She tried to brush it off. "I'm one of the event planners, so of course I am." Or she would be until the business went bankrupt. The thought of money made her turn to the driver once more. "I'm so sorry, sir. My partner is still back at the church, but if you'll call our office on Monday, I'll be sure you're taken care of." It might come out of her grocery budget, but Peggy would find a way. "Don't worry about me," the driver said, tipping his hat and slapping his reins to send his horse into motion. "Your gentleman already paid me in full." Surprise and relief were quickly followed by guilt. "Thank you, but you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. It was the quickest way to find you." "But you didn't know I was Peggy from middle school." He caught her hand in his once more. "That's true, but something else has not changed about you. Whether you are 12 or 28, whether you are my friend Peggy or the mysterious Margot, you are still the prettiest girl around." He raised her knuckles to his lips and kissed her hand. Good God Almighty, Peggy Winston had grown up to be beautiful. But Clay knew there was more to her than just a pretty face. There always had been. No wonder he hadn't been able to keep his eyes off Margot. He must have known subconsciously that she was Peggy. He offered Peggy his arm now that he'd made her blush so prettily by kissing her hand, and walked with her into the old brick warehouse. He took his hat off and held the door for her as his Uncle Joe had taught him to do from the moment Clay had been big enough to open one himself, then followed her into the ballroom-sized space. He stopped short. The rustic brick walls and polished wood floors had been transformed into some kind of Western wonderland. The tables were set with fine china and white tablecloths, but humble mason jars sparkled with candlelight. In fact, the whole place seemed to glow with twinkling white lights wrapped around the iron wagon wheels and square hay bales that lined the dance floors. Clay whistled low in appreciation. Peggy turned toward him, face alight with anticipation, pink skirt spinning around her long legs. "Do you like it?" "Like it." He was close to loving it and loving the woman who had created such a great atmosphere. She's here. She was indeed, and now that he'd found Peggy again, Clay had no intention of letting her go anytime soon. Or ever. Find yourself a nice girl to marry. Clay set his hat on the nearest table and shoved his hands into his pockets. Uncle Joe's words were still crazy, so Clay looked around the room one more time to gain his equilibrium. "This is just about the prettiest reception I've ever seen. Did you do this?" "I did. Janet handles almost everything else, the food, the music, the bookings, but I'm the designer." Her cheeks seemed to be as lovely a shade of pink as her dress. The theme was supposed to be cowboy glamour. "I've been to more weddings than I can count. I can honestly tell you I like this one the best. It's not so crazy girly, maybe. I mean, I expect a wedding to be girly, but this one makes it seem like you haven't forgotten about the groom completely. A man isn't out of place here." "That's exactly what I was hoping for." "Thank you." Clay just ducked his head in a nod of acknowledgement. He'd said something that had made her happy, and that made him almost absurdly happy as well. Standing here surrounded by wedding stuff and wearing a tuxedo, the idea of being the groom instead of the groomsman suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched, because he was thinking of that idea while looking at Peggy Winston, the smart one, the leader, the beauty. The one he'd missed so terribly when she hadn't been at school on the first day of 8th grade. The one he'd worked up all his courage to dance with long ago. The one he wanted to dance with now. "I'm so glad you like it." Peggy really was. Somehow Clay's sincere compliment took the sting out of her professional disappointment. This reception was not going to be seen by hundreds of people. It wouldn't establish her reputation in Austin, and the cost of the reception might bankrupt the fledgling company in which she'd invested her savings. Life wasn't fair, even when someone worked hard and did all the right things. But as the DJ played soft music and Peggy took in the twinkling white lights and leather accents, it was gratifying to know that Clay appreciated her attempt to make the reception just as much about the masculine as the feminine. Her design represented everything she thought a marriage should be, a blending of two people who didn't lose themselves, but who ended up even better when put together. The design represented everything her own attempt at marriage had not been. "May I have this dance?" Clay asked. She wanted to dance with him very much, but she'd been so badly burned the last time she'd been in a cowboy's arms. She hesitated. "I'm still working. I need to let the kitchen know. And the DJ. True. Some of Alvin's friends may be here soon too. But for now, it's just us. I'd be honored to have this one dance in a very beautiful setting with the very beautiful woman who created it." He held out his hand, palm up, patient. Nothing in her past was going to change. Nothing in her future either. She was going to go broke whether she danced with Clay or not. She might as well have a dream dance at her dream reception. She put her hand in Clay's. His fingers closed around hers. That was nearly as nerve-wracking as it was in the 7th grade. He seemed pretty confident to Peggy, however, as he walked with her to the center of the dance floor. "Let me see if I remember how this is done." He stayed a half step apart from her as he placed both hands on her waist. He stepped side to side with her right, left, right, smiling until she set her hands on his shoulders with a laugh. "I guess some things never change," she said. His focus was entirely on her, but with a slow blink, his gaze left hers to focus just a bit lower on her mouth. His smile turned to something a little more serious. Some things never change, but some things should, he murmured. For one thrilling moment, she thought he was going to lean in to kiss her. But instead, he slid one arm around her waist, pulling her close as he took her hand in the traditional ballroom pose for a slow Texas two-step. They moved together without speaking, holding one another's legs brushing in time to the music. As the song came to an end, their steps slowed until they were almost standing still, just marking time. He bent his head and he kissed her. Peggy didn't know how it would have felt if he'd been so bold in the school gym, but she knew how it felt now, and it felt heavenly. It was far from her first kiss, but it still surprised her how soft a hard man's lips could be. He kissed her gently, like she was precious. "Peggy Winston," he whispered over her lips. "You broke my heart on the first day of 8th grade. We moved that summer." He nodded a small movement with their faces so close. Of course, he must have guessed as much. "To New Mexico," she whispered, as if it mattered now. "I missed you," he said, and then his mouth closed over hers once more. As the groom's handful of guests arrived to eat and drink and discuss the day, Clay kept Peggy in sight. He wasn't going to let her disappear from his life a second time. He was leaning against a wall just a few feet away from her, tapping his Stetson idly against his thigh, when her business partner came up to her to give her some news. "We might not go bankrupt," Janet said. The bride wasn't lying when she said the groom was going to pay for almost everything. "The problem is, we need to get Alvin to pay us now. This week. Our rent is due. Overdue. This is serious." "There's no way I'm going to badger him for money this week. He's devastated. Look at him." Clay watched Peggy as she watched Alvin. There was a tenderness in her expression, and jealousy flashed through Clay's chest. "I've been in his shoes," Peggy said. "I know just what he's feeling." Peggy had been in Alvin's shoes, dumped at the altar by a cheater. Clay pushed away from the wall to stand squarely on his feet, but there was no one to confront, no way to protect Peggy from something that had happened in her past. "The Stannington Company is overdue. You did their event before I moved back to Austin. They're the ones we should pressure, not poor Alvin." "Yeah, but look at Alvin. He's going to be a lot easier to push than Stannington." Before Clay could step in to defend Alvin, Peggy did. "You can't pick on someone just because he looks like an easy target. We have to make this business work without stooping to playground tactics." Peggy hated to see anyone get picked on too, did she? Uncle Joe's words exploded in Clay's head, a nice girl to marry. Peggy was that and so much more. Still the smart one, the leader, beautiful and a beautiful kisser. "What are you staring at?" Clay snapped out of his thoughts to find Alvin at his elbow. Alvin jerked his head toward Peggy. "You got a thing for Margot I could introduce you." Clay clapped him on the shoulder in a friendly way, glad to see Alvin wasn't allowing himself to sink into a quagmire, at least not yet. "It's okay. I've known her longer than you, actually, but I haven't seen her since middle school." Janet turned around, spotted Alvin, and turned Peggy around too. Janet's conversation was a forced kind of cheerful. Peggy's was sincere, but it was Alvin's that made Clay cringe. Clay's really the hero in all this. He was the only person honest enough to tell me what was going on. Must be because he's a cowboy. Alvin faced Peggy squarely. As a wingman, he lacked all subtlety. "He's the real deal, a rodeo star." Rodeo Peggy sounded vaguely horrified. Clay felt a prickling of alarm. Usually women were attracted to the rodeo aura. Just who had left Peggy at the altar? "He moves around all the time, city after city. I was lucky he was in Austin this month." Alvin suddenly fell silent, apparently rethinking that statement. He nodded to himself. "Yes, very lucky." Hey, you two should dance. I'm paying for all this stuff. Someone might as well enjoy it. Janet jumped in. Speaking of paying for this, Clay knew Alvin would not leave precious moments in a lurch, so he took Peggy by the hand and led her to the dance floor. In the safety of Clay Cooper's arms, Peggy spilled the history of her love life. Confiding in him was a bittersweet comfort. She could have fallen in love with Clay so easily, only he wasn't just a cowboy, but also a rodeo man himself. Can I have your phone number? He asked. Hadn't he just listened to her tale? Didn't he understand that she wasn't going to get involved with a man who lived that traveling lifestyle again? I wrote my number in your yearbook once, but you never called. She softened her words with a smile. It took me all summer to work up the courage. By the time I called, it was too late. Your line was disconnected. I'm all grown up now and not very shy. I promise I will call you every day. Peggy's heart hurt at the temptation. Every day, he repeated. I came back to live with my Uncle Joe this spring. He had a stroke and needed someone to be around. I've been working at the River Mac Ranch for months now, not traveling to rodeos. But this wasn't Peggy's first rodeo or rodeo man. She knew men like Clay. They swore they could settle down, but they never did. And how long is left on the contract you signed with the River Mac? He looked away as they danced. 3 more weeks, but I've been thinking about giving up the rodeo. She stopped him with her palm on his tuxedo lapel. Don't, Clay. I appreciate the words, but I've learned the hard way that words aren't the same thing as action. He looked her in the eye at that. 3 weeks, Peggy. Give me those 3 weeks to prove some cowboys still wear white hats. He called her every single day. Peggy had already had one cowboy tell her all the right words, though. Clay threw himself into being the cowboy who had all the deeds to back them up. He stopped by his mother's house with Peggy, hoping that when he picked up tomatoes from his mother's garden, Peggy would see that he had roots in Austin. When a client canceled its company 4th of July party, he'd grilled steaks, while Peggy and Janet had frantically tried to find a way to pay the bills, which meant he'd also been there when a bride had called the same day to ask if precious moments could turn the canceled party into a patriotic wedding instead. He'd popped the cork on the champagne when they'd found out the bride's sister was a movie star. Their business would be in high demand after having a star of her caliber at their event. Clay rode the elevator to the rooftop venue in downtown Austin, ready to surprise Peggy with the biggest changes of all. He adjusted his tie. No tuxedo, he was only here as a guest, but Peggy didn't know that yet. Perhaps he wasn't a great guest since he was skipping the ceremony to catch Peggy alone before the reception. 3 weeks had been long enough, or rather 15 years, and 3 weeks had been long enough for him to know that he wanted to marry Peggy Winston. But Clay was nervous. He adjusted his tie again. The elevator doors opened, and Clay walked onto the rooftop terrace of the high-rise, transformed now into a red, white, and blue version of cowboy glamour. In the middle of it, with her arms full of white ribbons, stood a beautiful woman in pink. His beautiful woman in pink. Oh, Clay. She sounded more distressed than surprised to see him. They were out of white ribbons. They sent me ivory and ecru instead. Which do you think will work best? All his grand gestures had to wait. Ivory and ecru were important to Peggy, and that meant they were important to him. And if Clay had needed any final proof that he'd found the right woman to marry, well, there it was. Hours later, when the cake had been cut, the city of Austin filled the sky with fireworks. Clay carried 2 champagne flutes as he worked his way through the guests looking for a pink dress. When he found Peggy, tears were running down her face. He set the flutes down and wiped her cheek with his thumb. What's wrong? To his relief, she smiled. It was a wobbly smile, but a smile. I met Travis, your ranch foreman. He said you just signed another 6-month contract. I did. That made you cry. Not at all. But just now I overheard some of these Texas rescue guys talking about how the vacancy on one of the fire trucks just got filled. By you. Clay wiped her last tear away. The volunteer contract is for a full year. And then what? Clay adjusted his tie. That depends on other people, like Uncle Joe. Well, that's one of them. I'm staying until Uncle Joe doesn't need me anymore. Whether that takes a month, or a year, or 5 years, isn't up to me. Fireworks lit the sky on the opposite side of the building, so as the guests moved that way, Clay walked Peggy to the opposite corner, a quiet spot with a view of the city. The question, my beautiful Peggy, is, where will you be in 5 years? Because that's where I want to be. Oh, Clay. Her tears started again, but Clay couldn't wipe them away this time, because he lowered himself to one knee. No other woman has ever felt so right. You've always had a little sacred piece of my heart, the one reserved for first love and boyhood dreams. But the rest of my heart could use you too. You're the woman I love. He pulled the little velvet box out of his pocket. I know you're not crazy about weddings. If you don't want to plan a big wedding, that's all right with me. It's the marriage that I'm interested in. You're the woman I want to build a forever with. Peggy Winston, will you marry me? In whatever kind of ceremony makes you happy? As Peggy said yes, fireworks lit up the city sky above their little corner of the roof. 2 weeks later, Peggy wore her favorite pink dress to a little chapel in Las Vegas. With her first love by her side, she watched fireworks once more fill the night sky, marking the beginning of her happily ever after as Mrs. Clay Cooper.